We're going to be doing the Unit 9 review. So we are going to be looking over stuff that we learned just recently in Unit 9. So let's go ahead and let's take a look. So first of all, we learn about the product rule. And the product rule, basically what we learn is that when we have two variables, say x and y, what we can do is we can multiply the two of them together, and they are going to be equal to this times this. So negative 4 times y. So negative 8 times 4 is negative 32, and that's equal to negative 4y. So now what I need to do is solve that for y. So I'm going to go ahead and divide both sides by 4. And when I do that, I end up getting that y is equal to a positive 8. So that is my final answer for number 1. Next, taking a look at number 2. So for number 2, we're talking about earth science. Okay, so it says that as the temperature increases, the level of water decreases. So that implies inverse variation. Okay, so what that means is we have a temperature of 90 degrees Fahrenheit. So it's 90 times 11 feet. So if they're related inversely, we can use that product rule. Then for 110 degrees, it's x. So 90 times 11 is 990. And that's equal to 110x. So now we need to solve that for x. So I'm going to go ahead and divide both sides by 110. And when I divide both sides by 110, I end up getting that x is equal to 9. Now we already know the temperature, so what this represents is the feet. So it's 9 feet for number 2. Now, let's take a look at number 3. So we are simplifying these rational expressions. So first things first, 16 divided by 8. I can reduce that fraction. So 16 divided by 8 is going to give me 2. And then I have c cubed divided by c squared. And on the bottom, that's going to give me c. And then I have b to the 4th divided by b to the 1st. Subtract those exponents, and I get b to the 3rd. Okay, so remember that wherever your larger amount of letters are, that is where your letter should reside. So now we need to go ahead and get our excluded value. So for our excluded value, we know that 8c cubed b to the 1st cannot be equal to 0. Well, when you have a monomial, which is a bunch of terms being multiplied together, okay, each of those letters, no matter what exponent they're being raised to, cannot be equal to 0. So here, c cannot be equal to 0, and b cannot be equal to 0. Next, let's take a look at number 4. So between 3 and 15, you can divide out a 3. And then you're left with x minus 5. Okay, so then we need to factor out the bottom. So when you factor out the bottom, you're multiplying to 10 and adding to negative 7. So that's going to be negative 5 and negative 2. So let's go ahead and do that. So we have x minus 5 and x minus 2. So now I can go ahead and I can do some simplifying. So I can cancel out those factors right there. And then I'm left with 3 divided by x minus 2. And that's my simplified rational expression. Now, to calculate out your excluded values, you need to take a look at both factors that are on the bottom before you cancel anything out. Now, neither one of those factors can be equal to 0. So we're going to set them each to not equal 0. Here, we're going to add 5 to both sides, so we get that x cannot be 5. And then what we're going to do, and we're going to add 2 to both sides, and then we get that x cannot be 2. So then we have x cannot be 5 and x cannot be 2 for that one. Okay? So next, let's take a look at this one. Okay, so now when we are multiplying, what we need to do is simplify our rational expressions. And you can simplify it after you multiply or before if you notice some things you can simplify. I personally like to simplify the numbers to start off with. So from 5 and 15, I can divide both 5 and 15 by 5. So then on top, this becomes a 1 and this becomes a 3. Between 8 and 16, they're both divisible by 8, so that becomes a 1. And that becomes a 2. So up top, I'm going to have 2ab cubed c cubed once I simplify that out. And then on the bottom, we have 3a squared b c squared. Okay, so now we can go ahead and simplify this out. Well, it's going to stay as 2/3. I've already reduced that fraction. And then I have a to the 1st divided by a squared. So a to the 1st is going to go on the bottom. And then I have b cubed divided by b to the 1st. So b squared is going to stay up top. And then I have c cubed divided by c to the 1st, or 2nd, sorry. So c to the 1st is going to stay on top. So there's my simplified radical expression. Now I need to take a look at my excluded values. So 3a squared b c squared cannot be equal to 0. Now remember what I talked about before. When we have a monomial, a term like that, none of these letters can be equal to 0 for our excluded values. Because if any of those letters are equal to 0, then that will make our denominator equal to 0. So right here are our excluded values. So let's take a look at number 6. So number 6 requires us to do some factoring. So up top we have b plus 3. And then on the bottom I notice that I have 4b minus 12. Well, 4 and 12 are both divisible by 4. So sometimes when you're simplifying these, greatest common factor is another way of factoring it. So what I did is I divided both terms by 4 and I was left with b minus 3. So now for the second fraction I need to do some factoring. So I'm multiplying to 3 and adding to negative 4. So that's going to be negative 3 and negative 1. So up top I have b minus 3, b minus 1. And then on the bottom I'm multiplying to negative 30 and adding to negative 7. So that's negative 10 and positive 3. So I'm going to have that on the bottom, negative 10 and positive 3. So now I can go ahead and cancel out factors that are overlapping. So I can cancel out my b plus 3. I can cancel out my b minus 3. And then what I'm left with is b minus 1 divided by 4 times b minus 10. So to fully simplify this, I do want to distribute in that 4. So I have b minus 1 up top, and then on the bottom I'm going to take each of these terms and multiply them by 4. So I have 4b minus 40. So then that right there is your simplified rational expression. Now, to get our excluded values, we need to know that each of those factors cannot be equal to 0. So b minus 3 cannot be equal to 0, b minus 10 cannot be equal to 0, and b plus 3 cannot be equal to 0. Okay, so we want to, again, take our factors before we cross them off. That's when we find our excluded values. So b is not equal to 3, b is not equal to 10, and b is not equal to negative 3. Okay? So next, what we need to do is we need to look at division. So remember that when you are dividing, you need to flip the second fraction. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to write this out before I do anything else that with that second fraction flipped. So I'm going to put 9d cubed e divided by 2c cubed. Okay, so then what we need to do is we need to multiply. Okay, so I look at all the numbers and there's actually nothing that I can simplify out. So I'm going to go ahead and multiply right away. So I get 243 up top. And then I have c cubed, and I can actually multiply d squared times d cubed. When I do that, I add the exponents and get d to the 5th. On the bottom, 2 times 11 is 22, and then I get c cubed d. So now what I need to do is simplify out some of my letters. So I have 243 over 22. C cubed over c cubed cancels out. D to the 5th divided by d to the 1st is d to the 4th, and then I have e. So this right here is my final simplified version for number 7. What I need to do now is get my excluded value. So I'm going to look here before I cancel anything out. But actually, what I need to do is I need to look at the original, because notice that that e was on the bottom at some point. So each one of these cannot be equal to 0. So 11d cannot be equal to 0. Come on. 9d cubed e cannot be equal to 0. And also 2c cubed cannot be equal to 0. So when we go and we look at that one, basically, none of the letters can be equal to 0. So let's go ahead and let's write that out. So D cannot be 0, E cannot be 0, and C cannot be 0 for your excluded values. Okay? Next, let's go ahead and let's take a look at number 8. So for number 8, we're going to do some greatest common factoring. So I can take out a 2 out of that top one, and I'm left with x plus 2. Then on the bottom, I'm multiplying to 18 and adding to 11. So that's going to be 9 and 2. So I have x plus 2 and x plus 9. So now, when I go to factor out the second problem, what I'm going to do is flip it while I factor. So I'm going to flip that x plus 1 to the bottom. And then I'm also going to factor that other one. So I'm multiplying to 6 and adding to 5, which is 2 and 3. So I get x plus 2 x plus 3. So now, since I'm to multiplication, I can go ahead and cross off any factors that are overlapping. Well, I can cancel out the x plus 2's. And that's actually all that cancels out. So what I'm left with is 2 times x plus 2 times x plus 3 divided by x plus 9 times x plus 1. So what we need to do to simplify these out is we need to use the box method. Okay, so I'm going to just safely trust that you guys know how to use the box method and can simplify it from here. To take your excluded values for this one, you need the bottom of the first fraction, bottom and top of the second fraction. So what we know is x plus 2 cannot equal 0, x plus 9 cannot equal 0, x plus 1 cannot equal 0. What else do we have? Give it a second to get caught up here. And x plus 3 is the other one I'm missing. This is x plus 1 cannot equal 0, and x plus 3 cannot equal 0. So to get all of your excluded values, you end up getting, when you subtract them over, -2, -9, -1, and -3. Each of those represent values that x cannot be. So that's your final excluded value for that one. So let's go ahead and let's take a look at long division and synthetic division. So for number 9, you have to use long division because there's a 2 in front of that n. So I have 2n minus 3, and then underneath I have 4n cubed, and I'm going to actually leave a space for n squared. Okay, so since I left a space for n squared, I can now use long division. So I need to figure out what I need to multiply 2n by to get to 4n cubed, and I need to multiply it by 2n squared. So I'm taking each of these terms and multiplying them by 2n squared. 2 times 2 is 4, n to the first times n squared is n cubed. -3 times 2 is -6, and then you get n squared. So remember that this is being subtracted off. So I like to change it to a plus and change the signs of everything. So then I end up getting 6n squared. And I'm going to go ahead and bring down my 5n. So I need to figure out, that's a 6, not a 10, what I need to multiply 2 by to get to 6. And that's going to be 3, and to multiply from n to n squared, I need to multiply by n. So 2 times 3 is 6, n times n is n squared. -3 times 3 is -9, and then we get n. Again, recall that these are being subtracted off. So what I do is I change the signs so that I can do addition. 5n plus 9n gives me 14n. And then I'm dropping down the -21. So I need to figure out what I need to multiply 2 by to get to 7. And that's just, or to get to 14, which is 7. So I'm adding 7. Okay, so I'm multiplying each of those terms by 7. 2n times 7 is 14n. -3 times 7 is -21. So now I'm subtracting this off. So then I'm going to change the signs of everything, and I end up getting a remainder of 0. So that means that my answer is 2n squared plus 3n, or is it -3n? I can't see or remember. Positive 3n plus 7. And that's our final answer. So let's take a look at number 10. So we're going to use synthetic division. In the box goes the opposite of that one there. And then I'm going to write out the coefficients. I have 1, 3, and -24. So now I can go ahead and use synthetic division. So I'm going to take the 1 and drop it down. 1 times 4 is 4. 3 plus 4, adding down the columns, is 7. Now I'm going to multiply again. 7 times 4 is 28. Adding down the columns, -24 plus 28 is 4. So remember that the last number is always your remainder, then your constant, then your x term. Well, when I have 1x, I can just write it as x plus 7, and then our remainder we're going to write, and we're going to take our remainder and write it over what our original divisor was, which is x minus 4. So that right there is your final answer, and that concludes your note video with no Schoology quiz. Thanks for listening.